Good afternoon. My name is Allison Bainbridge, and I want to thank you so much for tuning in for today's book passage event. And for those of you who are listening that are visually impaired or cannot see, just so you know, I am sitting here with the book of the hour, these plant eyes on either side of me. I have dark hair and I have a Rush shirt on. And it is a true honor to introduce our guest author, Leona Godin, today. I've been fortunate to serve as a volunteer school docent at Guide Dogs here in San Rafael, where I live. And during my training to volunteer, the piece of information that made the biggest impression is the recommendation to us that rather than say blind people, that we refer to our clients as people who are blind. It sounds like such a simple concept, and yet it kind of was like mind-blowing to me. It sort of changed my whole thought process and how I refer to people in general in regard to anything these days. As we are not any one aspect of who we are, but that aspect is really just a part of our makeup. There's so many negative phrases too that use the word blind that I think it was essential that we had something, some explanation, some piece of work that demonstrates the injustice of this type of phrasing. And Their Plant Eyes addresses this issue superbly. Their Plant Eyes probes the ways in which blindness has shaped our ocular-centric culture, challenging deeply ingrained ideas about what it means to be blind. For millennia, blindness has been used to signify such things as thoughtlessness, blind faith, irrationality, blind rage, and unconsciousness, blind evolution. But at the same time, blind people have been othered as the recipients of special powers as compensation for lost sight, from the poetic gifts of John Milton to the heightened senses of the comic book hero Daredevil. Leona Godin, who began losing her vision at age 10, illuminates the often surprising history of both the condition of blindness and the myths and ideas that have grown up around it over the course of generations. She combines an analysis of blindness in art and culture, from King Lear to Star Wars, with a study of the science of blindness and key developments in accessibility, the white cane, embossed printing, digital technology, which I think is just been such a game changer, to paint a vivid personal and cultural history. It's a genre-defying work. Their Plant Eyes reveals just how essential blindness and vision are to humanity's understanding of itself in the world. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, now I see. It's just this sanctified conception of blindness that Leona Godin skewers in her elegant, fiercely argued Their Plant Eyes, which is a cultural history of blindness seasoned with bits of autobiography. James Tate Hill, the author of the memoir Blind Man's Bluff, wrote, "I've been waiting most of my life for a book like Their Plant Eyes to demystify what it means and doesn't mean to be blind. With eloquence and wit, Ms. Godin articulates what our culture has gotten wrong for centuries. Blindness, she makes clear, is a feature, not merely a difference. I'll be recommending this book every chance I get." She's a native of San Francisco. Ms. Godin dropped out of high school only to circle back to education via community college, then the University of California at Santa Cruz, followed by a doctoral program at New York University. While a graduate student, she taught a course called Conversations of the West. And the most intriguing sections in Their Plant Eyes form a kind of seminar, close readings of text through the prism of blindness. Homer, Sophocles, Shakespeare, Milton. She's a writer, performer, and educator who is blind. Her writing has appeared in multiple publications, and she has written and produced 2 theatrical productions. She founded the online magazine Aromatica Poetica as a forum for exploring the arts and sciences of smell and taste, not specifically for, but welcoming to blind readers who are blind, and writers. She holds a PhD in English Lit from NYU and has lectured on art, accessibility, disability, and technology. We want to also welcome Jason Roberts, who will be discussing Their Plant Eyes with Ms. Godin. Jason is the author of A Sense of the World, How a Blind Man Became History's Greatest Traveler, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. And he's working on the upcoming Every Living Thing. So warm welcome to both of you, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Oh,
Thank you, Allison.
What a wonderful introduction. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to say that This is a great opportunity for me. It's such a pleasure connecting with Dr. Godin, because we've been comparing notes and have some very similar background in many ways. I also was a high school dropout, and I also went to UC Santa Cruz and got sucked into the world of studying the classics. And she makes reference in this book to several courses that I took as well. I took it, I probably somewhere between 5 and 10 years before you did, Leona,
Yeah.
but the path was familiar to me.
Yes.
And what I find really fascinating is that,
Jason,
yes,
Jason, could I interrupt you for just 1
of
second?
course, of course.
For our blind brothers and sisters, we're just
Oh,
going to do a quick little. I'm so
that's
excited
right.
to talk to you as well. But we're just going to do a quick little image description. I've got long brown hair. I'm wearing some purple sunglasses, a black top. I don't know if you can see my brooch. No, you can't see it. But and behind me on the wall is also purple. And I've got sort of product placement. My book is back there next to some nice pink and peach colored roses.
Ah, that's great. I have brown hair and wearing a brown shirt, and have big headphones on. And on the wall behind me is a portrait of James Holman, the blind
Oh,
traveler.
yay!
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and I know that that Mr. Holman does show up in your book,
Oh, yes.
and that is definitely something we can touch upon. But what I find really interesting is the implicit ambition in this book, because the title is A Personal and Cultural History of Blindness. And I find fascinating that at the same time that you discussed your very personal story, you also did in fact need to take a tour through Western civilization. And I'm really interested in the genesis of that and how you play off the challenge, because it's ambitious. I think you pull it off completely, but this is one of those things that could have gone a little bit wrong, don't you think?
Oh, and it did. It's funny because yes, there were a few different proposals as I was working through putting this out there into the world, and it was sort of like it was kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears of like with my agent. The first one, this one's too much about you, and this is proposal state, and then the next one, it's not enough about you, and then sort of the third one, just right. And kind of a similar thing happened with once I actually got down to writing it. I I didn't know which timeline to follow, and I do think that a lot of cultural memoirs, or at least the ones that I've read, they can oftentimes they'll follow the person's life and then kind of bring in lots of cultural references. And when I first started writing this book, I kind of waffled back and forth, and it just was a big mess, I must say. So, we give all praise to the editors. We kind of finally had to, I had to pick one timeline or another. And I decided that I really wanted to be true to a kind of historical timeline and have my voice be more anecdotal and not worry so much about my memoir being linear or anything like that. So I kind of made a decision to be kind of a blind guide through this history, and bringing in my own personal story to kind of illuminate moments that might seem distant, in order to make or to hopefully help the reader see how ingrained and how present are these ancient ideas of blindness.
I see. I'm curious though, because one of the things that I found was how enduring some of the archetypes are. When you are discussing something like Homer and the relationship of the implicit blindness and the supposed connection to inspiration with Homer, and who may or may not have existed, but in all of the versions of his tenuous existence, he is blind. There's no version in which he's a professional tap dancer on the side, or something like that. And
not
and
yet.
so no, yeah, exactly. But you do a fascinating job of diving down into the implications of historicity, and so one of the things that I was surprised to find is that you're talking about the historical archetypes not just to be like historically completist or something like that.
Mm.
But every one of these archetypes, even something that's thousands of years old, you do connect with what's happening today. And I find interesting is that blind people are essentially the recipient or bear the burden of 3,000 years of crash perception. And not a single one of those has really gone away completely. And would you say that's something you feel like you're grappling with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of why I wrote the book, really. And it's interesting because at the top of the hour, Allison mentioned, sort of blind people. I feel like I have to make this statement, blind people versus people who are blind. And I have to say that throughout my book, I do say blind people and sighted people. I think either is fine by me. And of course, this is a choice for every individual and every individual writer. But I liked making the distinction between blind people and sighted people. So I will come back to your question, but I had to address the elephant in the room. So, sighted people, I think it's even an interesting term on its own, right? To think about the fact that it's not normal versus abnormal, but two states of being, blind people and sighted people. So I'll say that at first, but in terms of bearing the burden of an archetype like Homer is a very interesting thing. And I love complications. I love messiness. So my Homer chapter, which is the first chapter proper, opens up with a quote from a philosopher of the late antiquity, this guy named Proclus. And he said something along the lines of, those who believe that Homer was blind seem to me to be blind because he saw more than all Greece besides. So right away, you have both the archetype of blindness being connected with poetic gifts, i.e. Homer, and you have the doubt that that's possible. And those two, that kind of dichotomy of, on the one hand, believing that, spiritual or poetic gifts are given to those who are not distracted by the superficial visual world on the one hand, and on the other hand, a belief that actually blind people can't say anything intelligent about the sighted world and perhaps the world at all. And that's kind of a criticism that dogs, people like Homer, or who may or may not have existed, but people who very definitely existed, like John Milton, Helen Keller, and our very own James Holman, right? This doubt that you can speak to the visible world, that you could be a travel writer or have anything, interesting to say about the visual world, or maybe anything at all. So, yeah, these archetypes are very long and they're very widely oscillating, from kind of the best of humanity to the worst, and there's not a lot of in between. And I think that that's really the problem that I'm kind of trying to address in the book, that is very much alive today, where there's no such thing in the popular imagination as a normal blind person, that blindness automatically somehow makes you either special or pitiable or something. And I really wanted to kind of collapse those extremes of either the poet prophet on the one hand, or the superhero these days on the one hand, and the pitiable, kind of helpless victim or specimen on the other hand.
I feel like there are two audiences for this book. On one level, it is a deeply researched book of cultural history that would stand on its own for just the degree of research that you put into it. But in many ways, it's also a self-help book. And by that, I mean that it arms people with particular social tools. And I think that it arms sighted people with tools to basically move past a whole lot of preconceptions and unnecessary conversations. And it also, I think, does give visually impaired people the ability to maybe deftly move out of some of these things, because you have kind of pre-articulated a lot of what's universal. I find very interesting because you have historical topics and you have your personal topics, but they triangulate very neatly into a universal experience that I think other people can kind of tap into. One,
Ooh,
one of the
can I advertise those words?
yes, of course,
That's good.
of course, of course.
Thank
But
you.
one of the things about that, in terms of, because I believe you were probably quite ambivalent about the idea of taking up the mantle of all visually impaired people, and that in fact that triangulation was a way of bearing that lightly. But I find fascinating that that in many ways all people who are blind are storytellers. They are almost enforced into becoming so, because I'm sighted myself, but I've had the privilege of being friends with many visually impaired people. And one thing that I find is that when they meet new people, everybody wants to hear their story. And by their story, they mean their etiology, and they want to calibrate precisely just how handicapped they are. Can you see this or that? As if that makes, you know, some decisional point. And so there's something about the fact that you know, we always have to place your story first, and it's almost hung around your neck. And I really wonder about how you felt that even before you became a writer, and then how you translated that into your writing.
Oh my goodness. I think you're right. There's probably very few blind people that walk out onto the street and don't get approached on an almost daily basis by strangers kind of saying, on the one hand, you know, sort of, how much can you see, you know, and what's your story, as you say, and also wanting to give their story, right? I think that because there are fewer blind people than there are sighted people in the world, we sort of tend to feel a little bit like a novelty that, yes, must sort of explain our blindness. The biggest question is, were you born blind? This seems to mark something for people somehow. And the story of losing sight seems to be very, I think, intriguing for a lot of people, which is, of course, my story. I was born with full sight, but I've spent most of my life losing vision. So I've always been in kind of a state of recalibration. And it's been maybe in the last 10 years or so that I've been a totally blind person. But I think you're right that we're kind of forced into explaining ourselves, especially since so many of us do have some vision, you know, that we exist somewhere on that sight blindness spectrum, or continuum is maybe the better word, and that somehow it means something to sighted people to know that we have some vision. There's almost like a little sigh or another sigh when you say that you've lost vision. And I think you're right to connect it up with this long history of blindness as literary metaphor, and that the realization that we should be actually living our own lives that are just as complicated and as messy as the sighted person that might be sitting next to you on the bus is something that I think we all struggle against. You know, the kind of the monolith of blindness being the only aspect of our personality that matters. And so we also find ourselves, I think, in the position of telling a story that relates our blindness to the other parts of ourselves. You know, I'm a blind woman. It's, you know, it's not the same as being a blind man. You know, I have an artistic bent. You know, it's not the same as being a blind person who's a lawyer or a business person. You know, I mean, we have somebody who's gay, or who, you know, all of the permutations of being a person with blindness cross sections with, you know, other aspects of our lives. And I think that a lot of us feel like the blindness is the only story that people want to hear. And that is one thing that I'm definitely trying to unravel in this book, which is why I don't just use my own story, but I bring in a lot of blind memoirs to kind of show how things are similar and different, and how our experiences are similar because of the very strict stigma attached to blindness, as well as the very loved, tightly held sort of adoration of kind of the again, the blind poet prophet kind of
Exactly.
character on the other hand. Yeah.
But one of the things that I see that you do is you talk about basically, seizing that narrative and taking it by the horns and not avoiding it, but using that narrative energy to basically pull in people into something deeper. And one of the most fascinating treatments that you give is of Helen Keller, and you make the very astute point that she is famous for the story that is depicted in The Miracle Worker, which ends, I believe, when she was 11 years old.
I don't think she made it that far. I think like 7 or something.
Oh yeah, exactly. And that she did a lot more stuff, and in fact was quite a troublesome person for quite a lot of historians, because she made some uncomfortable statements.
Yes.
But one of the fascinating things that you do, 2 things that I would love you to address, is talking about how you do in fact move beyond that pat limitation of her narrative, because it's a redemption arc and it ends in some kind of redemption. But also, although this book is a work of serious scholarly inquiry, you also explore the subject in a play. And I'd be interested to find out about the differences in that.
Yeah. So starting sort of at the beginning, but trying to make it quick, I was writing my dissertation in 17th and 18th century English literature, and I stumbled upon a book called The Radical Lives of Helen Keller. And this was just before ebooks, just before Kindle took off. And so I thought, well, this sounds interesting. So I bought the hardcover book. I scanned it in using my Kurzweil OCR software, and I read about Helen Keller's really amazing, very lefty politics. She was a card-carrying socialist and one of the founding members of the NAACP, and just a really radical, wonderful thinker. But in that book, there was also just a kind of a throwaway line that said that Helen Keller performed on vaudeville with Anne Sullivan for 4 years, from 1920 to 24. And I stopped short. I mean, I couldn't believe that I had never heard this before. And then on top of that, I was kind of slipping off the grad school rails a little bit. And so I was kind of moonlighting as a performance artist in black box theaters in New York City. So immediately I kind of filed it away and said, I need to do something with this as a performer, because I did not at that time, when you're in the middle of your dissertation, writing another book is not, at least for me, that's not what I wanted to do. So I kind of filed it away and thought, I think this would make the fodder for some really good theater. And so I developed a one-woman show, bringing to bear the research that I had, that I'd been able to find about her time on vaudeville. She has another memoir. All the kind of memoirs that aren't the story of my life are the ones that I really like a lot. Like The World I Live In is very much about her perceptions of the world. And Midstream, I think it's called My Middle Years, is exactly that. So that discusses her time on vaudeville in great detail, and it's so charming and so wonderful. And her relationship to the theatrical world is just, it's so lovely that I really just stole a few paragraphs and kind of turned them into monologues and stuff in my play, because it's so surprising what she, how involved she was, and yet at the same time, how aloof. And I'll say this, she brought her politics to the vaudeville audiences. So there were question and answer periods that they kind of planned for, because they had been doing the lecture circuit for a very long, for several years, kind of between Story of My Life, and so kind of between the early years of the 20th century to 1920, they were doing the lecture circuit, and then they started doing the vaudeville circuit. And so they knew kind of what audiences would ask. But of course, in vaudeville, they were sort of even more over the top questions. And, they ranged from, do you dream? And like, what do you dream about? And could you tell my future? And to some pretty serious political questions. So my favorite one that she has, that they wrote down, that I don't know if it ever came their way or not, but this was what they had prepared. Miss Keller, what do you think of capitalism? And her answer, I think it has outgrown its usefulness. So she definitely was able to sneak her, her socialist politics in there. I mean, other things about sort of, what do you think of Harvard's discrimination
Yeah.
against the Jews, all sorts of things. So I guess what I'll say to answer this question is that the research that I had done for that play, very much, as you might have guessed, kind of got stuck into a chapter in this book. The big maybe difference, besides the obvious thing of the difference between writing a book and being on stage, pretending to be Helen Keller, is that it was kind of one of the many small stories that I've been telling, both as an academic and as an artist, for really 20 years at least. And so the book was a chance for me to bring a lot of these very disparate kinds of books into one place, and really see how things connected, kind of pulling these tendrils, because I kept seeing similar themes come along again and again. Like I said, Homer's name, at least, kind of experienced the same kind of prejudice as Helen Keller did. Her critics basically said she couldn't know anything. And now there's this horrible truther thing going on right now that doesn't even believe that Helen Keller actually, existed or was the author of her books or anything like that. So that doubt is something that kind of follows through the long story that I was able to tell in a book-length project that I couldn't tell, in a 45-minute, hour-long play.
One of the fascinating things that I've come to realize is that Helen Keller, being the most famous blind person in the world at the time, that she actually exemplifies a new paradigm of blindness, and that's the post-Victorian era of blindness, and that she was actually flourishing right around the time when things such as white canes became introduced. Guide dogs came a lot later. I think they really weren't rolling out till after World War II. But nowadays, we are really, really acclimated to having at least a benign view of blind people. And it's very hard to remember that before that, there was a huge amount of negativity associated with blindness for a number of reasons. But one primarily is that the leading cause of blindness among men, at least, was tertiary syphilis. And I know, for example, with James Holman, he went out of his way to get certification that he was a true gentleman, and that was code for the fact that he did not have syphilis. And I was actually hearing somebody on a podcast the other day concluding, oh yeah, that was probably syphilis. And that kind of negative association. But also, it wasn't unusual to go to a country fair and see as an amusement blind people being intentionally misdirected and directed on stage to fall over each other and do confusing things. The concept of laughing at people, and the places where the blind people would live, they were called asylums, and it had a stigma that it was very close to mental illness. And that idea and that falling in with the theology, which you, of course, drill down in a lot of the whole, I once was blind, but now I see. A few people rise above that, but they rise above it into a almost a celestial level, with in terms of like John Milton, so on and so forth. There's really very little in between. So I was really kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit with our listeners about how the Victorian, pre-Victorian notion of blindness equaling benightedness, equaling affliction, and you talk a little bit about purified by affliction. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, well, of course, even Helen Keller was very much a victim of a kind of a sainthood, right? That she wasn't allowed to have a kind of a messy adulthood. I think because of the fact that we tend to want our blind people, especially in the Victorian era, and really through, I would say it even probably began in the Middle Ages, and there's kind of this biblical reversal, right, of sort of I once was blind, now I see, and then of course you have the healing of the blind men by Jesus, and so there's this yeah, these reversals that are so powerful, you know, that either you see or you don't see, and we mean those both metaphorically and physically. And so, for example, Helen Keller was absolutely dissuaded from well, first of all, performing on vaudeville, because that's kind of a lowly form of entertainment, but also from having a sex life, you know, or marriage and children. And that's, you know, one of the things that I investigate is that when, even if blind people are given the credit of being able to rise above kind of the low expectations, the constraint is almost no less difficult to get around. So that, you know, to pity a blind person is one thing, but to also constrain them into a certain realm of kinds of activities that Helen Keller very much felt the brunt of is another kind of discrimination that can be equally difficult to get around, because as you said, there's kind of no middle ground. There's basically no representation, right, of blind mothers and of blind parents and of blind people going about the normal business of just having a life. And so I guess to just completely switch gears, but to address something else that you were talking about, is that I also take a little bit of issue with worrying about the ways in which blind people might be entertainers. And this is probably one of the more controversial things in my book, is that in all of the educations of the histories of the education of the blind that I was reading in my early days in grad school, that were kind of written in the mid 20th century, it was very clearly, you know, an idea of progress. And I agree, right? I mean, I'm very glad, very grateful to be a blind person in the 21st century, for sure. But I do think that sometimes we're a little too quick to say that things like, for example, just to go back to kind of the beginning of things in the Enlightenment, in 1771, there was a guy named Valentine Hauy. We call him Howie because it just makes it easier. He's known as like the father and the apostle of the blind. So he's the one that opened up the very first school for the blind in Paris in the 1780s. And the way that it started was precisely the kind of entertainment that you were just talking about, that he was wandering down a Paris street one day and he saw 10 blind men who were in dunce caps and asses' ears, and they were pretending to play broken instruments, and the audience was laughing and dancing and banging tankards of beer. And Howie said to himself, well, I want to educate these people. You know, that was his thought. He was of the Enlightenment persuasion and influenced by the philosophes, which is a wonderful thing. But I do worry sometimes that we don't think about how those blind men might have been feeling. And my argument is that it's just as possible that they were complicit in this whole entertainment. I mean, how many of our comedians are self-deprecatory, right? And they were not prisoners. I mean, they lived in a hospice, but most of them left the hospice on a daily basis. From everything that the histories tell us, they could go out and beg, they could go out and sell their wares. So it's way more likely that actually they were willing participants than that they were, and here's the buzzword, right, exploited. Because I worry about the word exploitation, because when Helen Keller was performing on vaudeville, that's what people said, right? That she was being exploited. And the problem with saying things like that is that it takes the initiative and the ability to make decisions for ourselves away from us. You know, Helen Keller was a 40-year-old woman, extremely smart, Radcliffe degree. And for people to say that because she was performing on vaudeville, she was being exploited is downright insulting. And so I guess I just want to keep those two lines of possibility open, that something could be actually really fun for those blind guys that were performing on the stage, probably getting a lot of free drinks, you know, the audience very excited. on the one hand, and also Howie's desire to kind of correct the scene, to educate these blind people on the other, that both of those things can and should exist in our imaginations, and not one be, I don't know, one be so much better than the other, because again, it takes away our will to be all kinds of people, not just saintly, inspirational.
Yes, and you have one of the more eye-opening, which is, I'm using it as an ironic pun, passages is was your profile of Ray Charles and discussing him, because here he was a professional musician, and he made no I mean, he was very clear that he was blind, but he also worked very hard to mediate it and to work against the common preconceptions of the time. And he said there are three things that I don't want. And maybe you'd like to explain to people what those three things were?
Yeah, what does he say? He says a cane, a dog, or a guitar.
Exactly.
Because he thought that every blind musician at the time, it seemed to him, was playing a guitar. So somehow playing the piano was, totally different for him. So, and so he would walk around without a cane, and he talks about memorizing the streets of a new town, like he would a Braille score, that he did not want the look of being blind. I mean, interestingly, he talks about how when he back in the early days when he was still a struggling musician and not when he was a superstar, that people would, of course, right away recognize that he was blind. So it's not that he thought he could get away with something. It was really the actual, sort of accoutrement of blindness is what he did not want to accept, and I talk about this a lot because to me, that fear of the stigma of blindness keeps us back. Ray Charles notwithstanding, he did pretty well for himself. I think we can all agree on that. But I think for many of us, not wanting to adopt these kind of the trappings of blindness keeps us from actually being good at being blind. I think so many of us who lose our vision later in life are terrified of picking up the white cane. And you know what? Once we do, we're like, wow, this is really useful. Stigma be damned. This is a really useful tool. So that is something that I try and address in the book, of the idea that sometimes the stigma of blindness is actually more difficult than just dealing with being blind, and that kind of keeps us from doing as well as we could.
And one of the things that you address in great detail is the process of reclaiming one's humanity in the other direction, because we are now, post-Victorian shame-based ideologies, this sort of thing. We have the whole blind as superpower. We have the daredevil syndrome, and you talk about what really interesting is that you profile Daniel Kish, who was also in my book, and where in terms of echolocation that's being taught, so on and so forth, people are now addressing that like it is another superpower, or people get it's almost the opposite of what you were saying earlier. When they need to decode your story for finding out exactly how blind you are, there's that little sigh of sadness. Now there's this like sigh of relief. Oh, well, then you have a superpower, and they get to feel good about themselves. And so I'd be interested if you're talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's great that you bring this up, because that's kind of one of the things that animates the book, but in particular, I deal with it in a chapter called the stigma and the Scylla and Charybdis of stigma and superpowers. So really those extremes that we as blind people kind of have to negotiate. And interestingly, I mean, Daniel Kish is amazing, and he's really, changing sort of the possibility of using our senses to their full extent. And I should say that for many decades, as blindness and sort of orientation and mobility was being codified by government and philanthropic organizations, echolocation was very much dissuaded, I guess. It was very much looked down upon because people were afraid that the blind person who was clicking or making other kinds of noises in order to kind of use active echolocation would be very alienating to
Leona,
the
just a second.
population at large.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but maybe
Yes.
for our listeners, you could give a bit of a context about echolocation and what that is all about.
Oh, and you can help me too, because you know about as much as I do. Yeah, probably more. So I think one thing that gets confusing is that there's kind of two versions of echolocation. I mean, they're the same thing, but they appear in the world to be quite different. So there's kind of an active echolocation that is what we think of when that bats do, right? That they are putting out sounds in order to gain information about the spatial world around them, as well as objects around them. So the echoes go out, they bounce back, and through that they are able to navigate. It's a different kind of imaging, really, because it's giving you a lot of information about the space around you. So it has a kind of a distance information system that is not unlike sight, that is useful, right, as sight is, in that way of being able to tell how big a room is, or how big a cave is, or where your prey is, and that sort of thing. So that's active echolocation. There's another part of echolocation that we don't even really think of as echolocation, but it's basically being able to tell those very same things by kind of ambient noises, whether it's footsteps, or simply a fan blowing and bouncing off of the walls around you to give a sense of the space. Interestingly, for many years, this was called in the blind facial vision. And I guess the easiest way to say it is that it's a passive kind of an echolocation, so that you're not even necessarily aware of those echoes. And in fact, it has a feel that it is kind of happening to the front of your face. One of my blind guides in my book is named Jacob Tversky, and he says how he was using it but didn't even realize that it had anything to do with echolocation, or even that it had anything to do with his ears, until he started reading about echolocation, because we didn't, as human beings, we didn't even know that it existed in bats until I think like the 40s or something, until they started doing research into sonar and things like that. And people didn't even believe it, right? They didn't believe that bats were actually doing such a thing, because this was, state of the art, top secret government activities and stuff. And so how could little bats do it? I talk about, oh my goodness, what is his name? Richard Dawkins talks about this. And so it's interesting. So there's this idea of echolocation. Now, a lot of little blind kids will learn very quickly that if they put sounds out into the world, that they receive feedback and can judge, walls and rooms and objects in front of them. And what I was referring to before is that those little blind kids were very much dissuaded from using that tool traditionally throughout most of the 20th century. So that's a perfect example of how the idea of inclusion can actually be detrimental to us flourishing as blind people. So, when Daniel Kish came along and was just, brilliant at echolocating, being able to ride a bike around and, go mountain biking and really have this full, amazing, adventurous life, using echolocation. It was kind of quite the rage there, right at the beginning of the 2000s, I would say, and up until today. And luckily now he's actually training other blind people to use this skill and to exploit what's actually part of human, kind of part of our human toolkit anyways. Interestingly about Daniel Kish too, is that he has this wonderful TED Talk where he talks about flash sonar. But he also says, I have my trusty white cane here. And it's funny how people seem to not latch onto that part of him, that they don't realize that echolocation is one tool in a blind person's toolkit. And yet, the white cane is still awfully useful. The guide dog is still awfully useful. It's not an either or situation. It's having these skills, having these skills, these tools in your toolkit is what's important.
And that's what I find compelling. Is this is one of the conclusions that you make is when we talk about these advanced skill sets, that there's almost that the idea being that there's almost a perceptual shift that can be made from trying so hard to convince sighted people that you're just like them, to claim a place alongside, to actually staking out a consciousness and awareness that is different and is useful in a toward all of human experience in that fashion. And one of the things that you talk about is you refer to spiritual blindness. Spiritual blindness is, I believe, the term that you use for over-reliance on visual objects. And I know that James Holman, he was a travel writer, he wrote travel books, and he argued that his being blind made him actually a better observer, not a lesser one. So I was just wondering if you can expand a little bit upon that.
Yeah, and I think that idea of spiritual blindness comes from that kind of biblical, reversal of seeing the physical world and being trapped on the kind of surfaces of things. And I think that's even the language that Holman uses. This idea of superficiality being as opposed to truth. Truth with a capital T, and the idea that kind of religion will help you to see those things that are beyond the eyes. And so that kind of gets at that idea of either spiritual sight or spiritual blindness, very much in a Christian context. And I think, James Holman is a Victorian, and I don't even know if we've said, for those who are out there that don't know who James Holman is, you should probably give your spiel about him, but he was the most traveled person of his day, and traveled around the world, having no sight, and lost his sight, what is it, as a young man, 20 or so, late teens or something,
25.
25. He had no sight, and also used echolocation, right? And that's what you talk about in your book, and that's why we connect up there with James Holman and Daniel Kish. So I think that he also uses the language of superficiality in order to explain how he could actually travel through the world and have something to say about these remote places that he was visiting, from Siberia to the Philippines or wherever, and have something to say that would be not just kind of unique in a circusy kind of way, but actually more profound, because he was impelled by curiosity to investigate, and not just kind of be satisfied with kind of surface appearances. In particular, I think, either whether they be beautiful or ugly, the kind of snap judgment that is sometimes associated with the traveler in a foreign land.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why the term for superficial traveling is sightseeing, and that's pretty much what he was pointing out is the idea that when I go to a place, I don't seek to confirm the particular points of view that I already came there with preconceptions. Yeah. So there did seem to be that, and there's a degree of complexity in non-sighted awareness that has been quite profound to me, and that vision, we use vision to simplify things. We use it to group things very quickly. And the best example that I have is we might look at a brick wall and we'll go, oh, that's a wall of bricks. But to a non visual person, each one of those bricks announces its individuality and its texture before it's unified and simplified that way. And so I did see that, and I saw pointings to that in your book, and perhaps it's with Dan Kish as well. But that idea that we've gone from affliction maybe purified by affliction to this kind of superhero thing. And what I'm seeing now is that maybe there is a next phase of understanding blindness, or of the cultural interface of blindness, that will be, it's a sensory adjacentness, so that, there's this ability to really go, okay, well, you are experiencing the world in a different way, but in an interesting and sometimes more complex way.
Yeah, or at least as complex, right? I mean, that's what I would like to argue. It's at least as complex, and it's at least as complex as the individual who's experiencing that sense. I mean, kind of one of my taglines for this book and kind of my life generally is that there are as many ways of being blind as there are of being sighted. Like, just give us the credit of having individuality within, a structure of, perceptual experience. Because I guess that's also related to this oscillation, right, between the super blind on the one hand, or the blind that is pitiful on the other hand, and not being allowed that in between, that we all have to learn and grow, right? We're not just given a superpower. I mean, most of us are not given a superpower. Most of us have to work at whatever we might be good at. We have to work with the tools that are at our disposal. Daniel Kish puts this so beautifully, right? He works through his troubles just like everybody else does. It's not, blind people don't feel like we're living a metaphor. We're not here to be a lesson for sighted people. And I think sometimes it feels that way a little bit. And maybe that is that Christian inflected narrative that we've had with us, that we're sort of occupying space in the books. And well, here's a problem, right? Is that most of the people that a lot of sighted people meet who are blind or visually impaired, they meet them in books and movies that were created by, you guessed it, sighted people, right? So, I mean, there's that problem as well, is that as opposed to us writing our own kind of blind characters and our own blind narratives that would maybe be much more quotidian, but also probably more interesting and complex, we kind of end up being like sidekicks in, sighted people's narratives of their travels through the metaphorical and physical worlds.
Yeah. Well, I think that if I look back on a transcription of this conversation, the word that I would probably be using the most was fascinating. I've said that a lot, and every single time I said it, it was heartfelt, because this is a book that is, it looks like a heavy lift, but it's an easy read. And
I like that.
Yeah, because there's the Ariadne's thread. You take us through. You do take us through some very dark passages. You do take us through periods in which people were, once again, to use a visual metaphor, unenlightened. But there's a strong thread. And like I said, the very effective use of your own memoir, which isn't a distraction. It's a rootedness and your way of once again taking this historical interpretation and making us realize that all of this is still a factor today. I think we're kind of running down to the end of our time, so I'm wondering whether or not there are any questions that we might be able to open up. I have there's one here from let's see here. It says, I have a friend who has been continuing to lose sight. I would like to get your book for her, but how does a visually impaired or blind person read your book? Do you have an audio version out?
Oh, I love this question. So a huge part of the book, I'll say, first of all, yes, it is absolutely available as an audiobook. I did read my audiobook, which is kind of a story into itself, because I spend quite a bit of time about investigating the history of the invention of Braille, and I love Braille, and I am a very, very slow Braille reader. So my goal was to try and get fast enough to read my own book, my own audiobook, but I did not get there. So I kind of fell back on my old ways, and my old ways is kind of using what I call an electronic Cyrano method. So I basically had my screen reader, my text-to-speech software, go through my book, and it was my earbud, and I pretty much repeated with hopefully more inflection and gusto than my electronic voice gave it to me. So I literally read my audiobook by ear. And that's available at all the usual places, from Audible to Libro FM. There is, of course, an ebook, and I should say this about the much maligned ebook, is that it's part of the digital age, which makes books infinitely more accessible than they used to be. Just to go back a little bit, when I was in college at City College of San Francisco, I could not read normal print anymore, and I was connected up with Recordings for the Blind. There were a couple different outlets for what were then called books on tape, very unsexy plastic boxes of cassettes, if you remember those. And now I can get basically every book that comes out as an ebook. And the beautiful thing about ebooks is that if you are visually impaired, you can enlarge the text. If you use text to speech, you can use it with screen reader, or if you are a good Braille reader or a struggling Braille reader like myself, you can use it with your wireless Braille display. So a digital text can be read in whatever way a visually impaired or blind person needs to read it. So I'll say that. So those are two accessible versions of the book. Also available through some blind organizations. We're still working on getting it up at NLS and things like that. So yes, very much available. And if they need any help further with that, I'm happy to give it. But yeah, great question.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Anyone would like to ask anything? No. Okay. Well, I really want to thank you, Dr. Godin.
Oh,
and
stop it some more. Leona will be fine for you, Jason.
I'm very impressed by everything that you've done, and
thank you.
And I hope that you will continue to explore things in across a broad variety of media. And I just want to say again how impressed I am, how deeply researched this book is, and yet how readable it is. So I really encourage people to, if they do have eyes to that work, to plant them in front of their plant eyes.
Yeah.
And thank you once again. It's been a wonderful time.
Goodness, thank you so much, and good luck with it. Everybody needs to watch out for Jason Roberts' upcoming book too. So
thank you both so much.
Thank you, Allison.
You both basically did my job for me, gave ringing endorsements, but I just want to remind people that we so appreciate you tuning in. We appreciate you supporting Book Passage in this last difficult year and a half by purchasing books and tuning into all of our incredible author events. And you can purchase the book. They're plant eyes. I'm holding up a copy right now for those who can see it at Book Passage. You can purchase it online, bookpassage.com, or you can call our store and order it. We can send it out to you. And we have a special treat. Leona sent us Braille book plates, which is a first. We've never had that before. So I'm just so thrilled that we could provide you those as long as we have copies. So order soon in order to get that. And thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing what both of you do in the future, and good luck.
Oh, thanks to Book Passage, and thank you. Thanks to all for being there today.
Yes. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.